We live in a really funny world, don't we? For the advert for the real Easter egg, they did an advert to go on the radio, and it was censored because they had to mention that it had a copy of the Easter story in, because Easter is about chocolate, not about Christ's death and resurrection. So then they, appealed and said, well, actually, Easter is quite a well-known Christian festival. And the advertising censor said, oh, is it? We didn't realise, and gave them permission. So funny place we've got to, isn't it, where Easter has become a secular celebration, and we miss something of the heart of what it's all about. Now, speaking of the heart of what it's all about, I was up early this morning and driving down to Liverpool at 7:30, as you do, dropping Lynn off for the Liverpool half marathon. So I'm starting, and she should have finished by now and be basking in the glory of a sweaty T-shirt and everything else that you get given. A seething mass of humanity on the pier head at 8:30 this morning. 8,000 sensible individuals choosing to run 13.1 miles round Sefton Park and other parts of Liverpool. And to get a T-shirt at the end of it, So when you see her wearing her T-shirt, go, oh, well done. We'll see what state she's in when I get home later. Anyway, I'm sure she'll be great. She's fit as a fiddle at the minute. We're looking at stories from the Old Testament, and we've done a bit of foundation from Genesis and a few of the people that we meet. We did Abraham and learnt about that our relationship with God is based simply on faith. Not on what we do or what we don't do or how good we are or how bad we are, simply by believing in the work that God has done on our behalf. And that gives us friendship with God. It restores us, that place of friendship with God. We also learned a little bit about Jacob. And Jacob was a rascal, wasn't he? Jacob really was a tremendous fella. But it's really only cementing the lessons of Abraham. If we relate to God by faith, it doesn't matter if you're such a tremendous guy like Jacob was, so self-centered, so manipulating of events, and so deliberately squashing other people in an attempt to gain benefit for himself, because in the end, when he too met with God by faith, everything was swept away and God started to work in his life. And today we're going to be dealing with Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons. Now, Jacob had a real handful. 4 wives and 12 sons. I don't know if you noticed in the reading, it says Joseph was hanging out with the sons of 2 of his stepmothers. What would you call them if your father's got 4 wives? Co-mothers? Well, anyway, there were 3 of them, and he was hanging out with the sons of 2 of them because he wasn't hanging out with the sons of his mother's sister, because relationships were too bad. He couldn't even spend time with them. And a tremendously complex situation that Jacob had. And it's interesting because the story of Joseph starts saying, this is the account of Jacob. You think, wait a minute, that was Jacob back then. How come this is still Jacob now? Because remember, when God got hold of Jacob, he still worked in Jacob. And as God does stuff in Joseph's life, and all of Joseph's suffering that we see now, as the poet John Donne said, no man is an island. Although Joseph was going through the mill, his father Jacob was also going through it. And what God was doing in Joseph, God was also reflecting in Jacob's life. God hadn't finished with Jacob, and God was still working in him. But maybe what we see in Joseph is not just that God works in a person, but how God works through a person. So I hope there'll be a bit of Abraham in all of us, that we relate to God through faith. I hope there's a bit of Jacob, that we all realize that we're pretty much scumbags down under the nice surface, but God still loves us and embraces us and cares for us. And God is still at work in us through these events. But Joseph is about God at work through us. Not just in us, not just what he does for us on our behalf. Because when we meet with God, God is not just interested in making us into nice people and taking us to heaven. God is in the work of making us co-workers with God. So what he does in the world doesn't just happen through legions of angels that are sent out, sort of like a la Dambusters, angels everywhere. That's not how God does it. He works in us, changes us, and doesn't have to wait until we're perfect to work through us into a world that needs him. And that's what Joseph's about. It's about learning to discern the hand of God in our lives and in the circumstances of life, and be able to write over our lives. You may have seen that in the reading that we had, how 4 times it said, you, but God, but God, but God. And somehow being able to grasp that God is at work in us and in the circumstances of our life. And he transforms us and he makes us into people who can be used by him to spread his kingdom across this world. And we have to learn, as Joseph did, to discern that hand of God and be able to say, but God. So it starts off as the story of Jacob. And it's funny, when God does things in your life, don't worry about the impact of that on people that you love around you. Because God at work in you will also be God at work in them. So this is the story of Jacob, even though it's the story of his son, because God is still working in Jacob to transform his life. And it starts off with the story of Joseph. Joseph was a youngster, now but a lad. And it's funny, God didn't work through Jacob's firstborn, Reuben, didn't work through his secondborn, through his thirdborn. He went right to the youngest. And God does choose some unlikely people. You know, you have people like Moses, when God calls him, says, I can't speak, I don't know how to speak. You have Gideon, when God finds Gideon and uses him. He says, but I'm the least of my family, why on earth me? When Jesus is revealed in Nazareth, what's Nathanael's reaction? Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? So never look down on yourself because you think, I'm too young, I'm too old, I'm too ugly, I'm too fat, I'm too beautiful, I'm too whatever. God can work in and through all of us. So he chooses Joseph and starts to work through this young lad, Joseph. Now, the scripture tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other sons. Ooh. And if you are a parent, know what a tough job it is to love your kids the same. And loving them the same can mean treating them differently. Maybe one of your children, if they were misbehaving, you could just sort of go, and they'd stop. Do that to the other one, and they go back at you. And sometimes loving them the same actually means treating them differently. And then explaining to them as they see this that actually I do love you the same. And just, it's complicated as a parent. You'll find out one day, and grandparents really enjoy, don't they, watching their kids go, ha 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 ha, told you. You know. It's a shame you have to wait 20 years for payback time. But Jacob really messed up here. He loved Joseph more than the rest, and it showed. And it says it made him a coat of many colours, as the song goes. Now, this is my best attempt. I'm just back from Wales, but this is not Welsh national dress. This is a silk-lined batik shirt from Indonesia. This is my attempt to imitate. I thought it was better than my bathrobe, you know, the stripes like that. But who knows exactly what it was, but it was something which distinguished Joseph, and made all his brothers aware that he really was the apple of his father's eye. And so he lived probably tormented by his brothers from a very early age, with his dad protecting him, an extremely unhealthy situation. The Bible reveals to us the reality of people's lives. You know, we often say warts and all. Well, the Bible shows that. The Bible is not a book of saints. It's a book of sinners who have met with God, who find God in their lives, and who God works in and through. And the Bible shows us these flaws and allows us to learn from them. Favoritism is deadly in any kind of context. And we'll see the fruit of that now, how that was worked out in Joseph's life. Now, Joseph had very clear gifts. He had prophetic insight. He had these dreams. And so when he has these dreams, well, you've got to know what to do with the gifts that God's given you, haven't you? It's one thing to have revelation from God. It's another thing to have the wisdom to know what to do with that revelation. And Joseph, at the tender age of 17, really didn't know how to handle the gift that God's given him. So as the reading said, as we saw that, he has this dream and he says, we were out in the fields. We were cutting corn. We were putting these sheaves together. And all your sheaves, just think of the background of the favoritism and the rejection and the anger that's there in his brothers. All your sheaves came and bowed down towards mine. Just imagine what's going on inside his brothers at this moment. And then he expands it a bit further. So he had another dream. The 11 stars and the sun and the moon came and bowed down before me. Now, his dad at least appreciated something was going on, because it says his brothers got angry, but Jacob pondered these things in his heart. But he still was a bit cross with his son. You know, is this what's going to happen? These things don't happen in the Middle East. Sons bow down before fathers. The younger bows down before the elder. The elder doesn't bow down before the younger. So God was speaking something into Joseph's heart. And God was revealing to him something of his future. And yet Jacob didn't have the wisdom to know what to do with that. To keep that inside. Maybe to find a bosom buddy to share it with, rather than his 11 brothers. We need wisdom to handle what God gives us. And that's one of the things that young people need most in ministry, is people to draw alongside them and to make up for the lack of wisdom, which simply comes from this lack of experience. Not in any way critically, but simply to help them as they develop the gifts that God's given them. Joseph could have done with someone like that, really. Anyway, off he goes. And it's funny then, the events that begin to progress here. And we've missed a few. The readings, obviously we're not be able to read the whole of the Joseph story. But you probably know what happens in that. And the amazing truth, which we need to write over these things, what Paul brings up in Romans. He said, God works all things together for good. Now, for the good of those that love him. And in our individualistic culture, we always take that as meaning that must be for my good. When sometimes in a culture which is more concerned with the group, maybe one person's sacrifice is what should actually bring good for the group as a whole. And sometimes it's hard to see how that's good for me, but maybe it's good for the whole body of people that were there. But as we look and see what happened to Joseph, we can say, well, it was good for Jacob. Why? Because God continued his work in Jacob's heart as Joseph went through all this ugly stuff. It was good for Joseph himself in the end. And you have to take a long-run view of things to see how it was good for Joseph, the suffering that he went through. And beyond Joseph, it was good for Israel. Israel as in that nation which was beginning to be born. The 12 sons of Jacob, and as they started to build their families and grow into that nation. It was good for the nation of Israel. But all of this happened at the price of an awful lot of suffering for one man, and that man was Joseph. So Joseph gets what I like to call Joseph's triple whammy. I'm not sure exactly what a triple whammy is, but I've heard it used and it sounded good. So maybe someone can enlighten me afterwards as to what a triple whammy is. But Joseph gets this triple whammy. 3 events, absolutely soul-crushing events. And I think a lesser person, or someone who was perhaps less able to discern what God was doing in his life, would have fallen at the first hurdle. But Joseph gets through all of this. The first one, he's sold into slavery by his brothers. Now, the near Middle East at that time was a rough place to be anyway. And you had to be on watch out because you'd get nabbed by someone and sold into slavery. But you've been sent by your dad to find out how your brothers are doing. And so off you go, and eventually you find them. And when you reach your brothers, they see you from afar and start plotting. And they say, first of all, let's get rid of him. Let's kill him. So when he arrives, they grab Joseph and they throw him down a dry well and say, we'll leave him there and we'll decide what to do with him later. We'll cut his throat, we'll do something like this, and that'll be the end of him. In the meantime, a camel train comes along. Not a train, okay, a camel train. It's camels joined together, no trains. Not Merseyrail. Right. This camel train comes along of slave traders. And one of the brothers has a bright idea. What will we gain by killing him? Whereas if we sell him, we've got about 50 pieces of silver to split between us. And he's done away with, who knows what will happen to him. End of story. So they haul him out of the well. They hand him over to the slave traders, who continue on their way. They pocket the money, and they take his ornamental robe off his back. They kill a goat. They sprinkle blood all over it, and they take it back to his father. And they say, look what we found. His father looks at it and says, my son, a wild animal will have got him. No DNA testing in those days. He couldn't tell it was goat's blood, not his son's blood. And so his father goes into mourning for the death of his beloved son. And Joseph's brothers are left with this burden of guilt on their lives, which we see will come out later as God works in them as well. So that's the first thing. He's sold into slavery. Slavery was not nice. But things seem to go okay. When he arrives in Egypt, he's sold to a captain of the guard, quite a nice man called Potiphar. And Potiphar takes a shining to him. Joseph is good at what he does. He's handsome, good-looking, clever, intelligent, trustworthy. So Potiphar puts him in charge of all of his household. And Joseph thinks, okay, maybe this slavery business isn't quite so good. And that's when, boom, second one of the triple whammy arrives. He's imprisoned by his master. Now, why does he get imprisoned? Basically, he's imprisoned for choosing to be a person of honor. He's in Potiphar's house, and as I say, he's good-looking, strapping young man. Potiphar's out with the guard all day. So his wife also takes a bit of a shine to Joseph and says, Joseph, can you come and serve me some wine in the inner chamber? So Joseph is lured in to where Potiphar's wife is reclining on a couch with the wine there. Come close to serve me, young man. Like this. He comes close, and so then she throws herself at him and says, come to bed with me if I told you about my husband. Anyway, we won't go down that road. EastEnders has got nothing on what's going on there. Now Joseph is faced with a bit of dilemma. What do I do now? And he decides to be an honorable man before God and before his master. And so he prizes himself away from the woman. But what does he leave behind? Not his ornamental robe, but his tunic, his top. Not quite sure exactly what he was wearing. Egyptians in all the drawings seem to only be wearing one sort of little sheet thing, so I wonder if, that's what he left behind and fled. But he leaves that behind and runs away, and his wife, Potiphar's wife, of course, cries wolf, and says, look what your Hebrew slave tried to do. He came in here while I was resting and tried to rape me. So Potiphar, of course, is furious and has Joseph thrown in prison. Just when things seem to be going well, he finds himself in prison. Now, prisons weren't a nice place either. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been able to see a 2nd millennium BC Egyptian prison? Not the kind of place we tend to go into, but they were rough places. But in the prison, things seem to go up for Joseph. He gets in the good books of the prison warder. The prison warder likes him. The prison warder puts him in charge of things, and again, Joseph is found doing a good job. And then one day, 2 of the Pharaoh's servants who've also been thrown into prison have dreams, and they tell Joseph their dreams. And Joseph is able to interpret their dreams, and the dreams involve being released. One of them would probably prefer to stay in prison because his dream that he'd get his head chopped off, whereas the other one was reinstated. So he might have preferred to stay in prison. But anyway, they both get released. And Joseph's only request is, when you're out, please talk to someone on the outside on my behalf. Get me out of here too. But they get out, and what happens? Conveniently, they forget about him. And so Joseph now finds himself abandoned by those who had become his friends and in prison. His life seems to be a roller coaster of opportunity, of favoritism, of being put forward and then crashing down after that. And somehow in this, Joseph manages to hold on, I think, to his faith, to his place as a worshipper of God, as a servant of God, and someone who was able to believe that despite all this, something would happen. And that's why I want to write over all this. But God. These tremendous circumstances in his life, he didn't know. It's very easy with hindsight, isn't it, when you look back and see what was going on and where that was taking and what God was doing. But Joseph didn't have that. Joseph only had the reality of what he was living through. Being sold into slavery by his brothers, being chucked into prison by the master who had embraced him, really, and then being abandoned by the friends he'd been able to make in prison. But suddenly in all this, the ruler of Egypt has a dream. And in this dream, he sees 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows. You may remember the story of the dream. And Joseph hasn't got a clue the Pharaoh hasn't got a clue what it means. He calls his wise men together. They can't remember, they can't work it out either. And that's when Joseph's friend from prison says, wait a minute, there was this young Hebrew in prison when I was there, and he told me my dream, and he told me my friend's dream as well. And both of them came true. Maybe he will be able to sort it out for you. So they send down to the prison, and the Bible's very detailed in this. It says he had a wash and a shave and changed his clothes. You don't go straight from medieval prison to the presence of a king without having a wash, having a shave, and changing your clothes. And there before the Pharaoh tells him his dream, and Joseph gives him the interpretation. And as Joseph speaks out this interpretation, the Pharaoh is just gobsmacked and thinks, wow, we're going to have 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine. We need someone with insight, with understanding, someone I can trust to put in charge over Egypt. Joseph, you're the man. You get the job. Just imagine what Joseph felt. You ever been for a job interview? When they give you the job? Imagine not going for a job interview and then being told you're prime minister. That's what happened. He turns up, and the Pharaoh puts a new robe on him, his own robe, puts a new ring on his finger, his own ring, and Joseph suddenly is in charge of everything in the land of Egypt. The only one who's above him is the Pharaoh himself. This is a real rags to riches type of story. And I can imagine Joseph thinking, oh, I've really made it now. Life has come good. He gets lovely wife, Pharaoh's daughter, everything he ever wanted. Servant, click of his fingers, everything happens. Enough to eat, in charge, just absolutely everything that he ever wanted. So Joseph is on the top of the world. But you know, this wasn't just about Joseph. We have to write, but God over this as well, because God was actually doing something which was way beyond what Joseph himself might have imagined. And this wasn't just about, this isn't a Hollywood story where you go through suffering and you come out the end, ding, and everything's wonderful like that. This is about God being at work in his people and through his people. And through the tremendously difficult circumstances of Joseph's life, God did something in him, but brought him to this place so that he might use him for his purposes. And that's when, as this famine starts to bite, Joseph is the person who can bring salvation to the whole of the nation of Israel. As Joseph's brothers come along, as Joseph's father comes along, and as the nation is saved through Joseph's administration of the riches there were in Israel at that time. Joseph, through all this journey that he'd been going through, in a sense you might say that, poor chap, he was at the mercy of others' actions, his brothers, his master's wife, the prison warder, the two guys in prison, Pharaoh. You might say he was at the mercy of circumstances, a famine, Ishmaelite traders, slave traders coming past, circumstances. But more than that, Joseph was at the mercy of his own decisions. You cannot control other people's actions, and you cannot control the circumstances around you, but you can control your own response, your own reactions, and your own decisions in the face of those circumstances. And that's what Joseph chose to do. He chose to remain faithful to a God who had become distant for him. He chose to remain faithful in circumstances which were what no one would have wanted. And I'd like to ask whether we ourselves, as we tread in the footsteps of Joseph in some way, whether we can do the same, whether we can refuse the bitterness which wants to take root in our hearts as we go through difficult circumstances and as people don't treat you right. People ain't nice. Have you noticed? We're not in heaven yet. We're not in that place where there'll be no more tears and no more crying because there are no more bullies and no more self-centered individuals who want to squash you for their own purposes. We're not in that place yet. You will still run across people who will choose to make you suffer. And you have to, like Joseph, refuse the bitterness which can take root in your heart like that. And as you do that, make the most of every single situation you find yourself in. Whether you're down a well, whether you're in a prison, whether you're serving in someone else's house, look for the path in which you can make the most of that situation. To do that, you probably find you have to try and discern God's hand. Try and see what God is doing in and through this. But like Joseph, I don't think you'll always be able to see it. And so when you can't see what God is doing, live for God anyway. Because as you do that, you'll be embracing his purposes for you, and you'll be allowing him to work through you on behalf of his people and on behalf of a world that he wants to reach. So like Joseph, let's write these words over our lives. Through the ups and downs, through things that happen, through other people's misdemeanors, and through your own decisions. Be aware of a God who's there with you, and choose to say, whatever else is happening out there, but God, because we know that God is at work in us and through us. But God.